technicalities of Zoom.
Yeah, I've been feeling like with these events, the benefit, like for thesis, I've been watching videos that were recorded in like 2013. So it's so great to have access to them. But then also I'm like, if this were in person, you'd either make it or you wouldn't. And it wouldn't be recorded. So like, sorry for your loss. So it's like,
Yeah. Okay, well, hi everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Randa Omar. I am the president of the Undergraduate Student Union, and I'll be moderating today. So today we're very, very excited to have Maya Mahgoub-Desai with us. So Maya Mahgoub-Desai is an associate professor at the current and the current chair of environmental design at OCAD University. Maya is both a researcher and practitioner whose approach to architecture, urban design, and design education is informed by her research interests in public and environmental health, cultural narratives, and socio-ecological models of conservation and urban development, and inclusion and decolonization in environmental design studio pedagogy. Maya's current research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and investigates themes related to human environment behavior, public health and public space design and policy, and inclusive approaches to community collaboration and urban planning. As a senior urban designer and planner for the award-winning firm Moriyama Teshima Architects, Maya has led many local and international urban and peri-urban master plans, which aim to provide resilient and equitable solutions and a collaborative community engagement approach. Maya's professional experience includes serving as a subject matter expert for Waterfront Toronto, developing master plans for Qatar's Education City, Surrey City Development Corporation and the town of Whitby, and campus plans for the University of Lethbridge, Wilfrid Laurier University, and Conestoga College. Maya also remains actively engaged in professional and volunteer activities that focus on health, equity, and racialized communities, serving as an executive member of BEAT, which is Building Equality in Architecture Toronto, a committee member of Climate Act, and previously as a crisis counselor for the Toronto Women's Rape and Crisis Center. So thank you very much, Professor Mahgoub-Desai, for joining us. We're very happy to have you. And yeah, I'll mute myself.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you to the AVSSU and GALDSU and FGSA for inviting me this evening to share with you what I've been up to since graduation from the MArch program in 2010. So I structured this presentation mostly in a chronological way. I'll start with a brief overview of my current job, talk a little bit about how I got here, as well as some projects and initiatives, and then end with hopefully some helpful tips that I've learned along the way. I hope no one minds, but I'm going to refer to my notes during the presentation in order to respect time, or I'll just keep going. Okay, so what is my current job? So I'm, as mentioned, I'm currently an associate professor and chair of environmental design at OCAD here in Toronto. And my role primarily entails teaching an environmental design undergraduate program, but also in the graduate design for health and inclusive design programs. So in addition to teaching, as chair, I do a great deal of admin work, curriculum, outreach, and a lot of student support. So as also mentioned, alongside my position at the university, I maintain practice as the senior urban designer and planner at Moriyama Teshima Architects. So as the only urban designer in the office, I have the great opportunity to lead a majority of the master plans in addition to providing planning support on architecture projects. I also felt it was important to get involved in professional service or volunteer work. that focuses on advancing issues of equity in the community. I started within the community and then in the profession. So I'm an executive member of BEAT, where I help organize public forums on issues like unconscious bias and emotional tax in the workplace. And I've previously been involved in certain initiatives, such as being on advisory committee for a women's shelter new build, or working as a crisis counselor for at-risk women. So basically, I am what is referred to as a hybrid research practitioner. So this means that in addition to teaching and practice, I can pursue research, but to a lesser degree than someone who doesn't already maintain an active practice. So as long as I still have the energy, it interests me to keep one foot in the academy and one in practice, because I do think that they mutually inform and benefit each other. So how did I get here? So it was interesting to kind of think about how I did get here. During my MArch, I had the opportunity actually to work on a range of projects. Mostly drawn from studios allowed me to focus on multidisciplinary approaches to landscape, environmental systems, and designing at the urban design scale. I think another really great thing that I enjoyed was being surrounded by classmates who were coming from a number of diverse backgrounds. So I had friends from astrophysics, film, biology, dance, and I think that was also really beneficial to my progress in this program. I was just asked about my thesis before. So these are images of a conceptual render and systems diagram from my thesis. And the project was entitled Synthetic Landscapes. And it basically took an interdisciplinary approach to looking at literary and artistic depictions of nature, and then challenging the binary notion of nature and culture and presenting this kind of speculative piece on ecological restoration and the potential role of technological imagination in redefining cultural landscapes. So soon after graduating, I was actually pretty lucky and grateful to join a firm that places strong value on site and context and celebrating the creative relationship between nature and culture. So much of my early experience was focused on the design of educational or cultural institutions, and included certain projects, as this one featured here, which is the Collaborative Health Education Building in Nova Scotia, part of Dalhousie. And this is a post-secondary facility that was designed to support a new type of collaboration-focused approach to health education. The idea was that nurses, physicians, and other medical professionals were expected to learn together in the same space, and thus change this kind of hierarchical relationship that tends to exist. So I also worked on several cultural institutions as part of both very small or very large teams. And I think that helped me further develop a number of essential soft skills, such as collaboration, ways of communicating, conflict management, and project coordination. So some of these projects include this one here, which is the Al Sira Museum in Kuwait City. And the Aga Khan and Ismaili Center that some of you may be familiar with. For those who are not, the center focuses on artistic, intellectual, and scientific contributions of Muslim civilizations. So I was very happy to work on this, also for personal reasons. So given that I wasn't at the time yet aware of which areas of the profession I'd be most interested in, I actually tried to request working on projects that varied in terms of functional program or scale or phase of development. So also as a junior designer, I worked on a number of competitions, such as this one here, which is for the Palestinian Museum. So this project, although it was quite brief, was particularly interesting and meaningful because it really contended with issues I was interested in, such as identity, displacement, and how does one build on contested land. So a couple of years into architectural practice, an opportunity had presented itself to work on a master plan. So the senior planner needed someone who is able to write strategically and conduct research, as well as someone who actually wanted to and was interested in community engagement, a systems thinking approach, and working at this sort of macro scale. So it turned out that I actually really like this kind of project. And so from then on, I almost primarily transitioned to working on urban design or planning projects. So as one of two designers, urban designers, I should say, at the time, I was actually afforded great latitude to propose approaches to urban design that addressed issues, again, that I was interested in, such as sustainability, inclusion, and health, where it was possible or where the client was interested in those issues as well. So in the last 8 years, I think, that sounds like a lot, my urban environmental design work has focused on solutions that try and find consensus among stakeholders and then bring together physical, social, economic, and cultural features to create hopefully meaningful and especially resilient places. So this is an example of a project. This is a Campbell Heights East Business Park neighborhood plan. And this is for Surrey Development Authority in BC. So this project basically had to negotiate an already existing proposal for an industrial park, where there were a lot of community concerns over the impact of the surrounding landscape. So the final proposal, which you see here to a certain degree, found a balance between conserving those employment lands for economic interests and implementing a strategy that would restore the salmon run, which you see here in red, create an accessible and multi-use conservation park for surrounding somewhat lower income communities that did not have access to park space, and establish eco corridors through the employment lands for safe passage for the local fauna. So a second example is the University of Lethbridge campus master plan. So through an extensive engagement process, actually in this one, the plan proposes these strategies for rebuilding the natural landscape from a number of these underused lots, paved lots that were, oops, sorry about that, that were basically all here and here and here, and establishing a community and campus identity that reflects the Blackfoot and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit student community. It also proposed an unprecedented car-free campus strategy in what is, a car-dependent community. And this was to encourage campus health through pedestrianization and also celebration and appreciation of outdoor recreation. And actually, for those of you who aren't familiar with the campus, the famous University Hall by Arthur Erickson is this building here. So other work that followed included a number of other public sector, primarily master plans, both local, international, and at varying scales of detail, size, complexity, as well as other, interesting opportunities such as, serving as a subject matter expert for Waterfront Toronto and doing analysis work. So teaching, my experience as a teaching assistant actually in both undergrad and during my MArch really did provide me with sound experience to start teaching when I graduated. So at first in Comp Ed, and then sessionally while in practice. And now fairly recently in a tenure track, well now tenured position. So actually teaching has been an amazing opportunity. If you can, I recommend it. It not only translates what you learn in practice, but also allows you to integrate and draw from past professional, educational, and lived experience. So for example, actually, growing up mixed race in Quebec in the 90s, and that gives away my age, and spending considerable amount of time in the birthplaces of my parents, provided me with this opportunity to engage and observe how people use their cities in diverse ways and relate to the land, as well as engage in different cultural and religious practices, and also respond to the impacts and consequences of colonial thinking. As a result, issues of identity, equity, and culture have become central to my teaching. So now that we see more women, people of color, and those who may not have previously had access to for economic, social, or health reasons are being provided these pathways into the profession. So as a teacher, I try my best to encourage students to identify and critique dominant practices, see the value in their own perspectives, their diverse perspectives, and their unique lived experiences, and thus contribute towards a socially engaged architecture that values empathy, equity, and inclusion. I also, as the first person of color to hold a chair position in the Faculty of Design at OCAD, I feel it's also my place to try and support students of color as they navigate their education and help them as best that I can enter the workforce. So teaching has also allowed me to integrate my experience in architecture and planning with my previous experience educationally and work-wise in the health sector. So the images you see here are from the Design for Health graduate program, where I co-teach a spatial and innovation studio and get the opportunity, actually an amazing opportunity, to work with students who come from a range of backgrounds, including design and architecture, but also social work and even emergency medicine. So projects in these studios have been in collaboration with a number of health institutions. We work closely with them and engage in things like research and thematic interview analysis in order to come up with these relevant solutions. So we've worked here, actually the students on the left are working on a project with sick kids physicians. And other projects have included designing with Toronto Rehab Institute's dementia unit, as well as Providence Healthcare's long-term care facilities. And then on the right, students are on a site visit with Toronto paramedics. This is just another example of work of one of my graduate students in inclusive design. So this is her final thesis that proposes a restorative toolkit for mental health. And it was grounded in research, but also in co-design with student groups and mental health professionals. So finally, in the past few years, I've tried to move towards more research-oriented projects, especially given my position in the academy. And I try and pursue research that is collaborative, that's multidisciplinary, and focuses again on many of the same issues I do in teaching and professional practice. So some of this research so far has focused on student perspectives on diversity and decolonization design education. Some on transportation equity to assist city councilors as part of Toronto's climate action strategy. And most recently, and most relevant and exciting, is a federally funded COVID-19 special initiative project. So this research project, which is just starting, will focus on a community-informed approach to looking at infection mitigation and control in the public realm, and is bringing together colleagues from design at OCAD, infectious diseases at University of Montreal, and the City of Toronto. So what have I learned along the way? So I think these are some things that have been probably mentioned before by our past speakers as well, but I think they are valuable tips. So I would actually really strongly agree with one of your previous guests, Dr. Rhoda de Jong, that people actually do like to help each other. So I think it's important to make friends, value collaboration, and help your peers, because these can be lifelong contacts that are not only great friendships, hopefully, but they can also help you in potentially finding a job or gaining insight into different firms or areas of the profession, or even presenting an opportunity to start your own studio or practice. The other one is asking for informational interviews. This was something I was not aware of when I started, but it's a really great way to get to know the industry or job areas you're interested in. And also to know if a particular position or job requires certain skills. And my experience is that designers and employers are quite willing to meet when they're not being pressured on the spot for a job. In retrospect too, I've come to realize that it really is our varied experiences and personal narratives, whether they do seem relevant at the time or not, that end up shaping those issues that you care about, and subsequently what you may end up focusing on later in life. So as such, I would say that what influences my design career now ultimately started very early in life. So being just out of school, I think, doesn't mean that you don't have applicable or meaningful skills and ideas to draw on, as well as very valuable lived experiences that can be great assets in a job. And finally, I would say, I think it's important to pursue what interests you and take advantage of opportunities that present themselves, even if those choices may not seem linear or the end goal may not be entirely clear. And I feel that if you are happy and engaged with what you're doing, you're more likely to succeed, and also to bring together your many interests in a meaningful way. So thank you. I hope I didn't go over our time. Okay, great. Should I stop sharing?
Sure, yeah, and then we can maybe, well, as you wish, really. Thank you, Maya, that was great. I didn't even notice the time pass by. When you asked, if you went over, I was not aware of the time. So Juliet, hi Juliet. Juliet here is my colleague. She's going to be moderating with me. Juliet, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, first off, thanks, Maya. That was great. I'm glad we got to chat a little bit in the kind of green room beforehand. And I really like the kind of the way you approach your teaching specifically was really kind of neat and interesting. And actually maybe to kickstart the Q&A with what I meant to say was with regards to the ethnography and kind of the site visit aspect. I think that provides a lot of richness in a learning environment. And I'm curious, in the last few months, obviously things have been a little more difficult in terms of getting out and visiting places and talking to people. And in your teaching, have you encouraged other ways of kind of recreating that same way of learning?
Well, our current situation has been quite challenging for that. And I'm not actually teaching a course this year, so I am relying on the insight and the expertise of other faculty to understand what are some of the strategies they're using. And I know that there had been a lot of discussions around how to address things like site visit. So I think some of the ideas that were tossed around are, for example, virtual visits, which I think, given the technology we have with things like Google, this is at least possible. I think also using local sites, so sites that students can walk to in a safe way, taking into account that students are sort of everywhere in the world right now, that they're even, if they would have been in Toronto, they aren't currently. So also, understanding that students may not have access to sites. There's also a lot of industries popping up to support this kind of endeavor. So industries and companies that have done mapping of various areas that are, we're in talks with about sharing that data. But I think ultimately what we're trying to do is offer choices. So not impose a particular way to visit a site, but offer different ways of gaining that knowledge. But there is a bit of a deficit in terms of like going as a group necessarily to a site, unless the instructor feels comfortable going to a site and then kind of sharing a video of that environment or something like that.
That's really interesting. I wonder if people have thought about that, like doing a Zoom in a park or something, or like on site and like showing the students what the site looks like. I have a question on a slightly different topic. You spoke about being the first person of color on the faculty at OCAD, I believe. And is that correct?
The first person of color to hold a chair position in design.
Well, okay, to hold the chair position in design at OCAD. And I also know that your research interests kind of lie like partially in inclusion and decolonization and environmental design studio pedagogy. And I know also a lot of us have had conversations about equity and inclusion, especially in the last like 6 to 8 months. Mm-hmm. And so as students, now that we are looking out kind of into the real world and looking at graduate schools and working environments and places we'd like to apply to, we kind of also just look at like who the faculty is, what their management looks like, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if that's something that you personally do, or if you have any kind of advice on how students can go about that, like doing research about the place that they would be going into.
Yeah, sure. I think many firms are trying to actively address issues of equity in their offices. And although change is slow, I feel that there is a genuine growing desire among a majority. I like to think so, which should obviously make the environment more inviting and inclusive for students that are graduating, going into these firms. I think, again, it's important to talk to people when you're looking into a place to work. A great way to really know the details is to talk to someone who works or has worked there, where you can ask what sort of opportunities are given to junior staff. Are there women or people of color in positions of leadership? Do they get similar opportunities? What is workload distribution between different equity groups? So I think certain questions that would maybe be for some uncomfortable to ask a potential employer is easier to ask someone who is working there, or a friend of a friend. I think I tend to look at a firm's equity policies as well. Do they have one? What is it? Is it actionable as well? And then have they also actively shown a commitment to equity through their activities, whether they be internal or external? And then I think compensation, it's always the topic no one wants to talk about. I think this information is key, but very hard to come by, and may only be accessible, if someone decides to share their personal experience. But I think it is a way of trying to understand whether there's parity, for example, gender parity in terms of compensation. And then there's like more subtle details that you can also take note of, such as whether job postings use gendered language, or if they only feature senior staff on a project on the website. So little cues like that, to be sort of attuned to those things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I would have never thought of because I guess it's also hard when you're looking from the outside and you don't know who their staff is, or who, what I mean is if they don't have the names of kind of younger designers, for example, working on a project, then we have no idea. Mm-hmm. We don't know that they don't exist, that they exist, but they're not shown. But they're good cues to kind of look into. And since you were talking about speaking to people who are in these spaces, I know you also mentioned informational interviews earlier. And you said that you kind of learned about that later on. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you kind of built your network, or maybe even how you got your first internships or jobs.
Yeah, of course. I don't really feel like I actively or strategically built my network. Maybe I should have. I think it sort of emerged organically through, friendships, family, classmates, work relationships, faculty. Faculty are great for making connections. And then also through some community work that I've done. So I think the network is sort of built in a mutual way. I think if you make an effort to support others or your peers in school, those connections last, and those connections can help you, and they're a big part of the network. I got my first, job as a student because I asked a friend whether the firm was hiring and what they were looking for. And this friend was willing to signal to them that I had applied because they felt comfortable doing so, because we had worked together on a project in school and it was successful, and I held up my end of the deal in the project and all that. So I think that's a really big way that's sometimes not acknowledged for the value that it has. I think also one has to feel comfortable reaching out to others, even if you don't know them. I once read a bunch of papers by this professor in psychiatry for some reason, and because I was interested in their work, I actually reached out to them. I knew they were at U of T, and I ended up meeting them for coffee a couple of times, and they were really helpful in some research ideas I was trying to develop. But that was like a cold call, right? But they're very receptive, and I've had similar sort of experiences. So if you see someone's work that you think is really great, I don't see a problem with, very politely kind of reaching out to them and telling them why you're reaching out to them. People, for the most part, are quite responsive. And then the informational interviews are similar, right? If there's a firm that you really like, they're not looking though, or they're not looking for your level, or there's a person at a firm who's doing really great work, or has had a certain career path that you're interested in, just reach out to them. and ask for, they call it informational interviews, but it really is just a chat, right? And I've done that as well when I had questions about where to go with urban design or planning, whether I should study more, all these things. I reached out to a partner at a firm whose experience profile was interesting to me. And they were very helpful in giving advice. So I think those are some ways.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm in thesis prep semester right now, and I don't know if it's COVID or if people are just feeling a little, I don't know, lonelier or disconnected, but anyone I've reached out to, like from all corners of the globe, have been super responsive and willing to help me, which has been nice. I have a few Zoom calls tomorrow with some people in like Michigan. It's great. I hope it continues. One question, it often feels like in urban design, landscape, and architecture, in these fields, change can really only be enforced and implemented from the top down with code or regulations coming into play in order to require efforts with regards to sustainability initiatives primarily. How do you suggest we as students and emerging practitioners work within the current systems to create the change that we want to see?
Great question. I think that that's a challenge because we work in, and I'm going to speak from an urban design point of view, work in sort of very highly regulated environment with multiple players, with multiple interests, ranging from, the environment, sustainability, let's say, and equity, to political sort of mandates that may govern a project. And so I think big change is probably difficult as an individual, but I think that if you're working on a particular, maybe to start off is to find organizations or firms that are doing that kind of work and making headway, right? I feel like that's a big step, right? Because especially as a sort of recent graduate, you're still learning, and you'd want to learn in an environment that supports these ideals, right? Because that's kind of the way that one would learn how to, let's say, negotiate certain terms with the client, right? Or challenge certain, regulatory issues, like, zoning. What are the official capacities, official ways of challenging these things? And I think also, I guess, as a student, or actually a last point is, especially with things like community engagement, right? There's nothing saying you can't kind of offer ways to create more inclusive community engagement opportunities, right? Point out who's not at the table and maybe how to address that, right? So I think that there are these kind of ways to get at it. I think as a student, there's also certain kind of like community groups or volunteer organizations that really do try and do this work. And I think that's a way to also get involved in a meaningful way is advocacy. I think it's also a way to learn more about certain issues, but it's also a way to make change in terms of changing perspectives, right? So I think that's an avenue as well. But I will say that there are challenges with making change always, and it's slow, and it can be frustrating, and there are barriers, right? So, yeah.
I had a quick follow-up question to that. When we were looking at your projects, I could kind of tell that there's, like, I can see a bit of a theme of your interests, and a lot of them do address, like, equity and inclusion, or maybe it's just that they, like, site-wise, they're, to me at least, they also seem very interesting. And I guess I was wondering if you kind of went out of your way to like request working on these projects, or was it kind of just like luck? Oh, I got to work on all these great projects. I know you also, like, some of them were competitions, I think you mentioned.
If I recall, it's sort of a combination of both. Sorry. So I think, as I said, like the firm that I joined, Moriyama Teshima, does a lot of the kind of work that I like. So, likely you end up on a project that's interesting to you, because the majority are. So in that way, it was more of a choice of the firm. And then in terms of some of the architecture projects, some I was put on, but I also, felt comfortable requesting certain projects. So the Palestinian Museum, I was put on that. And again, it's because, from being at the firm and talking with people, they also get to know your interests or your knowledge. So some of the projects that are, for example, the Middle Eastern projects, those are of interest to me. I've also been to a lot of those places, or have sort of a cultural insight due to my background. And so, when I requested to work on it, it seemed sort of natural. And then some projects like the Dalhousie project, I knew that it was in a development phase, and it was being run by a female architect. And I just went up to her and was like, I want to work on this. I promise not to screw it up, even though I've never done, this phase of a project. And she was willing to give me a chance. So it's sort of a combination of both. And then the planning projects, we've been, again, if the firm does certain type of work, it pursues more of that kind of work and tends to get that kind of work. So being on those projects, those planning projects, I tend to be on similar ones because that's the portfolio.
Thank you. I have a question with regards to licensure. So this will kind of relate to those of us who are undergrads who want to continue on in architecture, and then those of us who are in masters and are, will be getting licensed potentially soon. What do you feel are the largest obstacles to equity and equality within the licensure process? And are there any suggestions for how us as kind of a younger generation gearing up towards licensure could change that, perhaps?
Interesting. I think there's a lot of discussion around that right now. I think some of the barriers to licensure are really actually, they may be affected by issues of equity, but they really are the challenges of, and this is for the architecture license, getting the experience hours that you require in each category, right? And so that's really dependent on the projects in the office. And it tends to be slow because, projects if you're on very large institutional projects, the length of time to develop or construct that project is quite long. So I think that's been the challenge for many people that I know of. And so sometimes on smaller projects that goes faster, but again, the OAA looks for this like diversity of projects. It's somewhat similar for the planning license. For those who are interested in the planning license, again, it's sort of this like breadth of experience, and that comes over time and access to those types of projects, right? I think that there are, and this is my personal opinion, there are small things like the licensing exam for OAA is once a year. And that doesn't seem like a big deal, but if there are conflicts, if there are health challenges, if there's need for accommodation from an accessibility point of view, that can be limiting, right? And it's also tied to your experience hours. So I think there are things like that. I think that organizations like the OA are making headway when it comes to this. And that's why I was saying this is in discussion and looking at where there are equity issues. And I think that comes with data. So do we really know the landscape of the field? How many women are licensed? How many women are in leadership positions? How many people of color are licensed? Is there a discrepancy? What is the discrepancy? And then sort of doing that analysis in order to really understand what the patterns are, right? So we know that there are less women in architecture, but how many less women, right? How old are they? In what positions are they in? What kind of firms are they in? Where even, let's say within Ontario. I think, it's important to understand the data in order to really get to the root of where those inequities are.
Awesome. I think we have a question from the audience. If Renee, you wanted to unmute and ask yourself.
Yes, yeah. First of all, thank you for speaking today. It was really nice hearing you talk about your experience again after our chat last week. I also just wanted to ask you what you think the best way is for students in design right now to get involved in different organizations, and the best way maybe to gain mentors in architecture.
Good question. I think there's a few ways. And hi, Renee. Nice to see that you're here. I think in terms of organizations that do advocacy work or any type of organization that's volunteer, I think that if you see an organization that's doing something that you find meaningful, I think the best way is to just reach out to one of their contact people and ask how you can get involved just generally. And they may be looking for volunteers, or they may be looking for someone with certain skill sets. So I think usually the best way is sort of directly just talk to someone. In terms of gaining mentors, I think there's a few ways. One is that if you do find a firm that you end up joining, you'll likely meet the employees at that firm, and there may be someone that you end up working with that can provide guidance about the field in general. I feel that I experienced that working in a firm, especially when I started working for the senior urban planner. This was someone I was able to ask a lot of questions about in terms of the firm, about the field beyond just what's going on in the firm. And then there are partners that are women at the firm that I could talk to and that have been helpful in providing guidance. And then I think there's also just, we all do research, we see the work that firms do, or we see the profile of someone now that we have all these things like LinkedIn and social media access, that if there's someone that you feel you would connect with or is doing work that you might want to do, again, to just reach out to them, right? And maybe be kind of structured in what you're looking for too, right? I'm looking for someone to, run some ideas by, or it's someone that I can have contact with, every month and just talk about what's going on, or, maybe something more specific, right? Just so they get a sense of what you're looking for. And then the third way is actually through licensure. You are required to find a mentor. And I think it's important to ask someone that you feel you can have a much broader discussion with beyond, signing your experience hours.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, Maya, I'm going to throw a bit of a spanner in the works, but that's what I do. And I don't mean, because I think it's really important that for the most part, it's student questions, and I think they've been very much on point. But you did something going back to your time as a student where you were beginning to experiment with computation, digital fabrication. I wouldn't call it virtuality, but a way of approaching natural systems and human behavior, taking full advantage of the tools that were talked about, but actually weren't yet developed. And I find it very interesting that it has been foundational and a threshold to you being able to return to those roots of social activism, environmental responsibility, and direct engagement with people. But for you, it was through those tools. And I think it's very important, and perhaps you could, give a little bit of balance to that, to the students in the audience, of how one juggles this extraordinary condition, which of course has been made manifest in that, how many corners of the world was I in today as a mentor to students, practitioners? I was in Hong Kong, Iran, Venezuela. Where else was I today? And I'm teaching in Europe right now, but there's a directness, an indirectness, and how can one not get lost, not become isolated by these tools at our disposal?
Always with the hard questions. Well, I think a key, off the top of my head, I think, this is actually a question that requires some pondering, but I think a key piece is what you say, which is tools, right? And these are tools. And I think that when I did do my thesis, there was a sort of like heavy emphasis on these sort of like digital tools as a means of exploration that, as you've mentioned, have translated into some different set of tools now, right? And I think that's through practice, realizing and having access, broader access, I would say, for example, to community, right? Which I think can come to a certain degree in school, but less so. I do think that we're at a point where we're seeing this sort of greater intersection between the different worlds, whether they be the sort of virtual or hybrid or physical. And I actually think our current circumstances are allowing us to experiment and explore these areas and spaces, I should say. So, that's not a concrete answer, but it's more, it will be interesting to see how people innovate within these sort of hybrid spaces and how they would apply to, doing work, architecture work, for example, or urban design work, and how they, how we might benefit from them, but also be critical of what their limitations are. I think there's also, this newfound sort of love affair with, the ease by which we can connect across the world. But I think we also have to consider who can't connect in this way as well, right? So I think it's also bringing up issues of equity, for example, right? And access, both from positive and a negative way, right? So we may have some people may have more access because physical access is actually not possible for them. And so this has provided a new type of space, but for others, it may limit that, right? So it's interesting times in that sense. I hope that somewhat answers part of the question.
Well, it wasn't so much a question as I think what you were able to do was give that level of both caution and optimism to current circumstance. The challenges are different. The spaces of engagement are different. And you're very right. I mean, for example, in particularly younger students, elementary school. Oh, we can do it all online. Well, in fact, a great many people have no access, and it is reinforced exclusivity. And that's why the kind of engagement that you speak of is so important.
Mm-hmm.
It's all said in support of you, but I've been doing that for a lot of years, right? I care.
Do we have any other audience questions? Anyone that has anything they want to ask Maya? We are at time. Miranda, I don't know if you wanted to ask one final question yourself.
Sure. I always have more
if that's okay, and then we'll close it off.
Sure, for sure.
Thank you, David, for your question.
Yeah, I think you spoke a lot about kind of doing your MArch, but then focusing more on urban design and kind of touching on a few different disciplines throughout your career. And I know a lot of my friends and colleagues, even though we're like in our 4th year of architecture school now, we're still kind of like, oh, what are we going to do? Maybe it's going to be film, maybe it's going to be fashion design. And I'm wondering if now that you know where you're at in your career, where your interests lie, would you go back and take a different program than an MArch? Or you also spoke about kind of considering more education, I think, and I was wondering what you like. Would you ever go back to school now and do something else?
Yeah, interesting question. It's always easier in retrospect to speculate if there would have been a more sort of linear path if I had studied something different. Or, but I think for what I do now, the MArch did serve me well. I think it's an education that's quite broad and that encourages interdisciplinarity, and also I think really help you develop critical thinking skills, which are sort of this like universal no matter what you do, and I think are of great value. But I think, and I also think the fact that I didn't go directly into urban design was a good thing, because really understanding sort of architecture in practice, I think is very, very beneficial to being an urban designer, especially, and to lending a certain lens to planning as well, as planners come from various sort of disciplines. But I mean, maybe I would have taken a few more urban planning classes, some, additional studios, perhaps in forestry. So, one can speculate. And even now, I go online, I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to learn horticulture. And I think in terms of would I go back to school, I think, being in academia, part of its appeal to me is learning. whether it be learning from students or doing research, which is a form of learning, through investigation. It's all about learning, right? And being exposed to different knowledges and perspectives. And I think that potentially, you know, I may pursue more school if something, you know, opportunity presents itself. It's kind of the way I roll. To see what presents itself, being open to possibility.
Great, that was a great answer. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Maya, for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for holding these sessions. I think they're really great.
Yeah, this is like our first season, and hopefully it'll become a new tradition at the
season like it's a TV show. We've got yeah. That being said, we do have one next week for MLA, so next week at the same time.
Wonderful.
Maya, this was great. Thank you so much for being here and for making the time.
Of course.
Took a lot of notes. All right. Well, have a great night, everyone.